Well, good morning and good afternoon to you, wherever you may be as you tune in today. And thank you for joining us. I'm Sonya Sepahban, CEO of OurOffice, where we help organizations with the process, expertise, data, and technology you need to build a more inclusive workplace. Our end-to-end solution for workplace diversity, equity and inclusion works especially well for small and medium organizations who want to focus on DEI, but maybe stretched too thin for time or resources, but also for larger organizations. First, I want to thank Deb Sinta for joining me and to welcome her. Welcome, Deb. We'll get to know Deb in a moment, but before we get into the meat of this conversation, let's make sure you're familiar with the logistics. I think most of us know Zoom webinar tool, but just in case, I want to make sure that everybody knows this is an interactive webinar, so we will have a few polls throughout to get your inputs as part of the conversation. Also, please note that we really encourage you to use the chat function to provide your comments, and we also welcome questions throughout the webinar. You can put them in the Q&A. We have one of my colleagues at our office, Anushka Sarif, who will be moderating the questions in real time and chiming in as needed. Thank you in advance, Anushka. We will answer as many questions as we can, at the end, and also afterwards if needed. So if you provide your email address, if you ask a question and it's not answered, if we don't have time, please add your email. You can do it in a direct chat to us, and we will answer it afterwards. Also, please note that this session is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on our events page at ouroffice.io/events. Last but not least, this webinar is approved for SHRM and also HRCI recertification credits. You will find the activity codes on the last slide. So let's get started, shall we? So Deb, I guess we'll just start with you. Can you give a bit of introduction on your background, how you got interested in workplace culture? You have a really interesting journey, and just let us know where you come from. And
Sure. Yeah, sure. Sonia, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and very excited about this conversation. As you know, it's definitely an area of passion for me. So I lead talent, inclusion, and culture for Tenneco here in Chicago, and I have had, I'd say, a good chunk of my career focused on culture-related work. And so my background is organizational development. I've had about 12 years in OD roles, center of expertise roles in different large Fortune 100 private and public companies. And prior to that, about 10 or so years in consulting, working with different organizations. And so culture was always, somewhat central to the work that I did in the talent space. I think that it really became a passion of mine as I saw more and more about how kind of the idea of purpose really impacts talent and how it can really impact the engagement of a team and ultimately company results. So as companies started talking more and more about purpose and culture, it became very interesting to me. And I had a couple of opportunities with companies that I've worked with where culture became very much at the forefront. And in both cases, it was as a result of M&A activity. So in one scenario, I was working with a company that was spinning off from a larger company and rebranding, reinventing themselves. And our new CEO at the time was talking a lot about the culture he was envisioning for this new company. And as he talked about it, I realized the culture he was describing was not the culture of the company we were, separating from. And so therefore I knew that the team that was coming with that spinoff wasn't necessarily modeling that culture that he was describing. So he had one sort of vision in mind, and the company, the team was operating in a whole different way. And when we, had that realization, we took time to sort of step back and say, if we don't do something intentionally to bring to life the culture that we're envisioning, we're really not going to, it's not going to happen. People are going to come and they're going to continue to work in the way that they have in this prior company, which was a really big holding company, very sort of bureaucratic, a little bit slow moving. Our CEO was talking about agility and speed and entrepreneurial spirit and all of these kind of things. And so we had the opportunity at that point to really paint the picture for the culture of the new company and communicate that. And as a result of that, we were able to kind of move the team in the direction we wanted to. But it was really through a very intentional effort. It wasn't organic. It was really something that we did intentionally. So that experience, I think, really solidified my interest. And since then, I've been able to do some similar work in a number of different companies, and most recently Tenneco. So it's definitely an area of passion.
Well, yes, and we'll talk a lot more about, why is even culture still important? I mean, it seems like everybody has been talking about it forever, but we'll talk about that and then being intentional about it in a moment. But you make a really great point just right up front about how important it is when leaders talk about, anything really, but especially culture, that they, is consistent with the organization or the team's experience. And if it's not, to then be upfront and sort of, transparent about the fact that maybe this is not where we are, but we want to be there, right? But you can't talk about it like it's here and everybody else goes, wait a minute, which company am I at? What organization are these people talking about? So we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's find out a little bit about our audience, shall we? Let's go to our first poll, if we could. And here we're just asking, just to rate your organization from what you know. I don't want people to stress out about this. Sometimes people get a little concerned about how to respond to this. Here's a bit of a definitions of what we mean by these different terms. Just share with us if you think your organization right now in terms of workplace culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, is aware, focused, progressive, or world-class. If you don't know, or some people say, well, our organization is just unaware altogether, then you can put, I'm not sure. But as we look at this, it's coming in as about 30% aware, about 40% focused, or about equally maybe 40-40 aware and focused, and progressive about 20%. There's about 10% not sure. That's pretty consistent. A lot of organizations we find in our research and working with our customers at our office are somewhere either in the aware stage or the focus stage. And I'll tell you, there is no right place to be. Anywhere you are, this idea of continuous improvement, right? So wherever you are, there's always, the next step to take. And it's perfectly fine to be just aware. That's actually a great place to be, because you can, from there, you can really start and do all kinds of things to improve and to do it in a way that will benefit both the organization and all the key stakeholders, including the employees, of course. So now that we know a little bit more, it's kind of settling around 30% aware and 40% focused, 20% progressive. So this is, and I'm delighted about the 20% progressive. That's kind of a little bit of a hard bar. But with that information, now that we know a little bit about our audience, let's go forward and talk about just, you kind of went on a little bit to give us a story in terms of your background and how you got interested. But there's been so much talk about workplace culture. I see between you and I just see some people roll their eyes sometimes. But why is it that it must remain a leadership imperative? I mean, today, there's so much going on with the ongoing pandemic, which seems it's going to be with us for a long time yet. And with supply chain shortages, I mean, I sit on a company board, you have, you're on the very senior levels of executive leadership, and you're around the boardroom. There's a lot of conversation about a lot of different really difficulties, inflation coming, all kinds of things. Workplace culture just seems like it's important, but sometimes it seems like, not really an imperative. We're really at the top of the list of the things that the leaders should spend a lot of time and effort on. So how do you talk to your leadership, if I may, or to any leaders? I know you're very active in the community of thought leaders. How do you talk to people and kind of convince them that this really is an imperative up there with those other priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is and can be a differentiator. And I think it's, more than ever at this point in time in particular, it will separate company from company in the war for talent. We're all competing for the same, sort of static pool of talent, shrinking, by the way, pool of talent. And so culture can truly be a differentiator. When you talk to people about why they work where they work, or why they purchase brands that they purchase, or why they do business with companies that they do business with, a lot of the motivation is driven by purpose, and companies that have a purpose attract talent, because talent wants to work in a purposeful way, almost, more importantly than anything these days. So I think that companies that, all companies are good at measuring their performance, their sort of profitability, shareholder return, the bottom line, margin. All of that is inherent in running a business. You're constantly looking at those things. Being in manufacturing, we're constantly looking at the numbers, right? So that stuff's really easy to measure. I think what's maybe caused people to not think of culture as an imperative, maybe in the past, or maybe some of those folks that are rolling their eyes when the question comes up. I think a lot of times leaders just struggle to understand how you can measure company health, and really, company health is a huge driver of impact. And the culture is what I'm talking about when I talk about company health. So, if you've got highly engaged team members who are committed to the cause and working towards a purpose, and putting in that discretionary effort, you're going to get the results as a company. We all know that when you're in a toxic culture or a negative culture, the opposite happens. People disengage, they don't buy in, they don't want to put in that extra effort, and those companies ultimately will not be as successful. And there's a lot of data out there to show that companies that have intentional cultures, that have a purpose, that have a commitment around things like diversity, inclusion, and equity, are the ones that are outperforming. They're the ones that are leading. So I really think, it's a differentiator for all companies. And then when you layer on top of that, the last couple of years, the war for talent, everything that's going on in the world, it's almost, I'd say, a business imperative.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think you could turn around the question that I asked you almost completely and say, how could you not look for a differentiator like this when everybody is struggling with all these other, issues and challenges that all businesses are dealing with? So in effect, it's the other way around, right? There are so many things going on, and everybody's doing their best. But at the end of the day, if the ships are not arriving, if you have supply chain issues, if there's inflationary headwinds, at the end of the day, what is there that you could actually do? You could really put your mind to it and internally focus on that and get a lot of benefit without having to deal with external challenges that are not under your control. To me, I always talk about, well, what's controllable? You may be spending a lot of time, and you should, right, on how to deal with all of these pressures that everyone is right now having to deal with. But the one thing you could, really one of the few things that you can put your mind to, and with relatively, it just doesn't even take as much effort. It always seems like such a hard thing to do, and we'll talk about this later too, but especially for smaller organizations too. I think a lot of large organizations are spending a lot of money and resources and assigning people to it. They can afford to do these things to really build their brand. I think these days, not only is really important, as you said, all of the workforce itself, being more engaged and productive. Clearly, there's a lot of information about that. How much more, somewhere between 6 to 8 times more innovative, better business outcomes. These are numbers that are put out there by major firms that do this kind of research. But also, and then of course, the retention and the hiring. Millennials, there's data that millennials are 3 times more likely to stay at a company if it has inclusive culture. 80% plus of all candidates, whether they're male or female, say that being in an organization where they can feel like they belong and they're included is in their top 3 list of factors they consider when selecting an employer. So that's all true, but at the same time, there's these other really important factors too. It's just your branding for your customers. A lot of customers now care. Those millennials and Gen Zers, more and more, their purchasing power is increasing, and they truly care about these factors. I'm not saying that Gen X and baby boomers like ourselves don't care. We care too. But I think that that's just it's kind of being on the right side of history, where the importance of these things to customers and then also to the investors. I think ESG is becoming, the environmental, social, and governance type of issues are becoming more and more important to investors. There are many who are now really, making it a requirement, some of the very well-known ones. So I think, there's just so many reasons why it is indeed a very, a big imperative, I think, to focus on it. And one of the few controllables that we can still do something about. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. And I think you hit on something really important. We've been talking about over the last few years, when we look at the talent trends, this idea of we talk a lot about the social enterprise, this idea that people are looking to corporations, large and small, to really do much more than produce good products and make money. It really is, increasingly critical when you think about what corporate America has done to impact the whole COVID situation. Employers were very integral to helping drive some of the decisions that happened over the course of the last couple of years. And so I think this idea of social enterprise, private citizens looking at organizations to fix what's not working, right? Whether it be government and legislation related or community related, the communities we work in look to us to make those communities better. So how we're treating our teams is really critical. So I think you're spot on that this idea of social is really the S in ESG in particular is particularly critical, and diversity is so integral to that. And again, I think ESG and ESG targets, diversity targets, are rapidly becoming not the differentiators necessarily. They're table stakes.
Yeah.
So if you're behind, you're really behind.
Yeah, exactly. And I always tell people too, it's 2022, it's not 2019. These things have really moved forward. And I think you make a great point about really the changing definition of what an enterprise or any company of any size is really about. There's a couple of data points that kind of jump to my mind. One is about, but first of all, we know that a couple of years ago, the business roundtable, came out with including really in the definition of what is the purpose of a company. from, maximizing what we all learned in MBA school, maximizing shareholder value to, a broader kind of stakeholders. And then we saw some of the, the SEC approval of the NASDAQ diversity rule, the SEC human capital requirements for disclosure, although they were kind of flexible about it, whatever anybody wants to disclose. And then in the first year of when that came out, I saw a report last year where one of the major firms did some analysis on the first year of disclosures, where they found that over 50% of the organizations chose on their own, even though they weren't required to. They were just required to disclose whatever they chose about human capital. And they chose to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion and workplace culture as what they actually disclosed. So on their own, they found that was material to share. The other thing is, I saw also another stat. I'm an engineer, so I love numbers, and I know you do too. But I think data really says it all. And those who don't pay attention to data will suffer the consequences. But I saw something that said over 80% of Americans, at least, and I would dare say it's probably not that different around the world, especially in Western countries, is that they do really expect of companies and organizations to take a stand and to help causes that are social and societal. So I think that there is really the importance there. We have a good question that is just in the Q&A. It says, is there a credible way to measure the intentional journey for an organization? We're going to talk about, this is kind of a good segue to just being intentional in general, but I want to say to this, if you agree with me, let's get to that conversation about what even an intentional culture means, and then I want to make sure that we answer this question in concert with that. But before we go too much further, I do have one other poll here that I'd like to put up before we go. And so let's talk here a little bit about why are people, so we talk about it as an imperative, but for organizations, usually people that call into our webinars are in some ways aware of DEI, and their organizations are typically have interest in it. So what's the main reason for your organization's interest, do you think, in workplace culture and DEI? You can, here in this question, you're not limited to one, you can select more than one. So we see CEO focus, 63%. That is typically a big reason. So this really shows the importance of leadership, right? In terms of the organization's focus, really on anything, but in this case, of course, in workplace culture and DEI. So we have about 60% there, about 25% external requirements. So here we typically include, things like NASDAQ or SEC or ESG, investor requirements, board requirements we include in here. At about 40% hiring and retention. That's of course a big one, as you mentioned. And then an internal champion other than the CEO, but some other champion, about 20%. This is very typical. Again, we see this, settling down about, again, close to about 50-60% is CEO focus. So that's all the CEOs out there that tune in or listen to the recordings later on. This is like no pressure, but you can see how important it is, right? We all knew that, but this happens poll after poll. Whenever we do this, it always comes out that the CEO focus is over, it's the majority of the responses there. But as we discussed, hiring, retention, and external requirements are becoming more and more key reasons for people to be focused on this. And thank you so much for the participation. This is very important. We do these polls all the time, and we aggregate the data. We have a research arm that is always trying to put out as much information as we can to the community. So we appreciate the participation in the polls. So now let's go on and talk a little bit about the meat of the matter that we started talking about before, and that is what does it mean to be intentional? So yes, workplace culture is important. We just talked about it. You talked a little bit about the idea, you introduced it up front, but let's talk about it a little bit more, if you would.
Yeah. Well, the old adage is true about, culture eating strategy for breakfast. It still holds true. And, I think the best laid plans without the support of a highly engaged and positive, team, it don't come to fruition, right? So I think that still holds true, today as much as it ever did. As we think about, being intentional, I think you hit on something important. This idea of measurement and data is so true. And, being able to, as I mentioned earlier, organizational health is hard to measure. It's gray, it's squishy. We can look at representation for sure. We can look at results in terms of how people are producing, but looking at the how things happen is more difficult. And I think, one of the things that I took a lot to my team about is this idea of memorable, measurable, and scalable. So, one of the approaches that I think really works when it comes to culture is, if you can create a framework that is memorable, so simple, easy to understand, and you can remember what it is, and then put some measurement or metrics against that. That means it has to be behavioral, it has to be able to be measured, you have to be able to see it. And then you've got to be able to scale it, whether you're a small company or a large company, it has to scale to the size you need. Those are the key aspects. So I think having a cultural framework that is, memorable, measurable, scalable, so important to the success. And I'll share one additional story from my past, actually another M&A story, but a company that had recently acquired another company, really predominantly for the skills and capabilities of the people in that company. And I met with the CEO at the time, and he talked a lot about how the merger was going to be really, really easy because the values of the companies were so aligned, and everyone, was really in sync in terms of what they stood for. They were both sort of Midwestern companies. They were both very values-based. There was a lot of sense of community and collaboration and purpose. And so he was confident that this merger was going to go, seamlessly. And then as we started to, as I started working within the company, I started to see that wasn't the case, and people weren't interacting and working together the way we had thought. And that while the values that were stated on paper or wherever were very similar between the two companies, how people did business was very different. So we started seeing kind of cracks in the structure around one team that was very relationship focused, and another team that was a little bit more sort of execution focused. And some little nuances that started showing up that caused the team to not really come together the way we had thought. And ultimately what we had to do is we had to step back and say, let's recommunicate what it is why do we exist? What is it we believe in? What are the values core to who we are? And then how do we want to behave on a day-to-day basis? And putting that framework together in a memorable, measurable, scalable way so that it could be communicated across the organization, you start to drive behavior, and then you can measure that behavior. And similarly, at Tenneco, we look at the how and the what. When we talk about performance management, it's not just meeting your goals, it's did you do it in a way that makes us better as an organization? Did you do it in a way that exemplifies the culture that we're trying to drive and the values that we believe in? And so, I think that's what I mean when I think about intentional. And I think that it's culture is going to happen whether you like it or not. So you may as well be intentional and get what you want. And I think a lot more companies are doing that. And my role currently wasn't one that existed prior, right? Because our senior leadership and our board of directors understood the importance of culture, engagement, diversity, inclusion, and they invested in it and said, this is something we need to tackle in a really intentional way. And I think a lot of companies are doing that.
No, I love what you say about, being intentional and how, it's really important in anything we do in life, right? If we let anything just be, right? Our health, our wealth, anything that's left to its own, there's this, again, this is my engineering background showing up. There is the second law of thermodynamics. and forgive me for going there, but it says entropy, which is basically the measure of disorder in anything. It just naturally always increases. So I kind of want to go back to the good question that was asked about how do you measure it? How do you measure if you're being intentional? I'd say that, and I do love your memorable, measurable, and scalable. I'm going to steal that from you. But the measurable piece of this is if you start measuring and you see that things are improving in whatever dimensions that really matter to you, whether it's employee engagement or employee satisfaction, different parameters that people use, then it must be it must be that it's being intentional, because you are actually improving, and that just doesn't happen on its own if it were left to its own devices. And I would say let's unpack, to better understand how we could even measure it. Let's unpack what are the elements of being intentional. You kind of touched upon it. Is the organizations here? You had an M&A, and you thought that, well, the leaders thought we are, both from the same region, we're in the same business, so we must be similar, right? But I think the key thing that for me always comes up, and you just mentioned it too, is start with the why, right? Why? I mean, if you just randomly go to two different organizations and ask the people just randomly, why does this organization exist? You will find that people will give widely different answers. And I think just like Simon Sinek says, it's start with the why, right? I mean, that's really where you can begin to understand what people and by extension, of course, organizations that they build, what they're about. When you give me some examples of where you've seen, like interesting examples of where what people's whys are, for organizations.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is so true, and I think that whole idea of starting with the why is so important. And I read a book years ago that by Daniel Pink, and it was talking about motivation and what motivates people. And his position was that there were basically three things that motivate us way beyond money and some of the things we typically think about when we think about motivation. And one of those three things is purpose. And there was this and tons of studies and data in the book around when people understand how what they're doing connects to an ultimate reason for being, their performance improves. And you can't get better, for example, you can't get better creativity by paying more. You can get better creativity by getting people connected to the why that something's happening. So I think that that's a real, example of the why. And, again, in all of the companies that I've had the opportunity to work within and work on this cultural, aspect, it's always started with why, so it's kind of who are we and why do we exist? And then attached to that is what do we believe and how do we operate? Those things in concert are really what drive the culture. And I think when I think about inclusion and engagement and culture in general, there's I could point to some very specific examples, even within the HR world, where an intentional culture and a culture of inclusion and engagement have really driven very specific results. And that's things like crowdsourcing on innovation, for example. So using our business resource groups to give input on a workplace environment, right? So we're all talking about, coming back to the office at some point in some way, shape, or form. That's going to look differently. So, why wouldn't I engage with my young professionals BRG to get their input on what's going to be attractive in the workplace of the future? That's an idea of, crowdsourcing innovation, or having my high potential groups talk to, there was a program that we did in a couple of years ago, at the beginning of COVID, where we used our hypo development program to have them work on COVID and how we will communicate and work in the COVID situation. And they came up with some, amazing ideas and suggestions that I don't think we would have come up with without their input. And so, grassroots efforts that are going on. So I've seen, team members coming together to put programs together for other team members on things like mental health. BRGs, again, working on things like parental leave and how do we look at our policies and stuff. So I think that this idea of, if driving this culture of inclusion and engagement, you've got that opportunity to kind of crowdsource new and different ideas. If you've got the diversity of team, you're going to get diversity of ideas. And I think that that's really, so important.
Yeah, this is such an untapped resource, right? A lot of times, I say to leaders of the organizations that we work with, it's like, just ask them, right?
Yeah.
Like, people will tell you if you just ask them and if they see that their input matters. I'm reminded, as you were talking about, purpose of Daniel Pink's, the three things that motivate people, right? It's mastery, autonomy, and purpose. Really the important ones. We have also a good question, which I think is really contributes to this conversation. They say, people will say that culture is defined by the worst thing that's tolerated. What is the worst thing or set of things that can be tolerated by a culture and yet still make progress in towards our culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think that the sometimes starting with that view of what's the worst thing, right? What's the least possible acceptable, having the ability and willingness to be consistent about that, and thinking about what's required or aspired to, but then also what's the line of unacceptable. At what point do we say you can't work here because you don't live the culture, you don't behave in a way that consistent with the culture? And I think leaders sometimes struggle to really hold that line firm. When somebody's producing great numbers and not doing it in a very nice way, it is a little bit of a tough pill to swallow to say, I'm going to have to, exit this team member because they aren't contributing to the culture in the way that I need them to. And, it's similar with engagement. We talk about improving engagement, and it's this sort of nebulous idea of we want to be more inclusive, we want to be more engaged. Sometimes it's just about removing the barriers to engagement. So it's not about driving engagement. It's let's stop doing the things that really stop people from being productive. You think about the team member experience end to end, are we making things harder? Are we disengaging people along the way? When the new hire comes in the first day, is their day one experience commensurate with their experience in the interviewing process? Or have we painted a picture for them that's just not real when they show up? Or using looking at the systems and processes we use, and on one hand we talk about being agile and innovative and moving fast, and and all of these things. And then on the other hand, we say, here's our, ancient, cumbersome, awful system that you now have to do 75 steps to get to, the solution. So, sometimes our sort of infrastructure doesn't line up with our behaviors. And I think leaders have to be willing to make those calls, be willing to, again, deal with the high performing but poorly behaving team member, call out the fact that our systems are driving redundancy or waste or things that are not productive, and make the investment in a different way of doing things. I think those are some of the things that, sort of on the negative end of things, I call them barriers to engagement, but they're really the things that we have to look to. And and I think when we talk about the way we work, the way we act, no one can be above that, right? So the CEO has to model the values just as much as everyone on the shop floor, if not more, right? They have to be kind of the role model. And I think that's another place where sometimes companies go wrong. They paint a picture of, here are the values, this is what we believe in, we're going to put them up on the wall in the lobby or whatever, but then we don't hold people accountable in that way. We don't measure performance that way. We don't reward people when it comes to bonus time for living those values, and that's where it breaks down.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It is so important to live the values, and if anything, I totally agree with you that the bar should be higher, right, for the leaders, because they're the ones who are setting the rules, right? So if they define them, they should follow them first and foremost. So I think it is just one of those rules that you just can't break even once, and it's very hard to get that trust back. The last thing I'll add to all the great stuff you said about this answer to the question of what's the worst thing, in a culture that you can tolerate, I would say, one of the things that we talk about is a culture is defined by, how you deal with mistakes. Right? Humans make mistakes, right? And what the organization's reaction is to a mistake, an honest mistake, right? I mean, we're not talking about stuff where, any nefarious stuff, but stuff where people just make a mistake, how do you deal with that? Does that become a learning experience for everybody? Or is it, more of it just like, let's just crucify them and make teach everybody else. I mean, there's just different ways that leaders can react to those things. And on the subject of purpose, we have a good question actually in the expanding on what Daniel Pink's, mastery, autonomy, and purpose. It brings to my mind, they have a good question I'll go to in a moment, but it brought to my mind because they talk about NASA, and of course, NASA, for example, has, I was fortunate to be at NASA for about a decade in my earlier career, so it's near and dear to my heart. And I will say that I was definitely, when you're at an organization like NASA, there's, a higher purpose that everybody aspires towards. And this is best shown when, President Kennedy went to NASA in the 60s, and the famous story where he asked the janitor was, in the hallway, and asked him, what are you doing? And he said, well, Mr. President, I'm sending man to the moon. So, there's some organizations that have an obvious purpose, but not everybody in that organization necessarily feels like maybe in their job, if they're a janitor or some other role that's not directly related, they may not, have to make sure that everybody feels that purpose, first of all, in organizations where the purpose is somewhat kind of a given. But then the question here asks, is, but how about when it's not immediately obvious to create that purpose? So they're saying, compare NASA in 60s and 70s to a manufacturer that makes door handles. How does this latter, the manufacturer of the door handles, convey a sense of a higher purpose?
Yeah, Yeah, it's a really good question. And, there's so many companies that are truly purpose driven and very well publicized for being that way. I think of people like Tom's Shoes and,
Yeah.
companies that are giving, truly, giving back. And then, those that are manufacturing the door handles. And, how do you get people, connected in there? And, again, I think it is working in service of something that we believe in, so if we understand what the team at large is motivated by and wants to accomplish, then that's a big piece of it. The janitor at NASA, it's a great example. He could have quite easily been clueless about what the plan was. Right, and he could still have done his job just as well. And I think that's sometimes the gap we have is, I call it the iceberg of ignorance, but it's sometimes the higher in the organization we are, the less we know about what's really going on. So being able to understand why we exist as a company, but also understanding what our team is aspiring to, what their motivating factors are, and then helping them understand how their work ties to the end result. Going back to the janitor again, if he hadn't been doing his work, what would have happened? Would somebody else have had to do that work and therefore not been able to do other work, which then causes a break in the chain and ultimately impacts our ability to get to the moon? So I do think there is an aspect of understanding the team at large, being clear on what the purpose is as far as the company, but also helping really connect the dots to say, the work you're doing here contributes in these ways. And I think that's what's so important. And there was a video that circulated a couple of years ago on I think it was on YouTube, and it was an employee at a consulting firm basically made a YouTube video of quitting to her boss, and it was aimed at her boss, and it was, here are all the reasons I'm leaving this company because of the way you treated me. And they're all really, things that I would say connect to lack of understanding purpose. It was kind of like, I'm working lots of hours, I'm underappreciated, nobody's telling me the big picture, I don't feel like I'm, contributing, and yet I feel like I'm exhausted. Yeah. and I think that's that's even more critical for the generation of workers that we're looking at, now and in the future.
No, absolutely. I that was a very good one. It was also on TikTok. Yeah, it was very I've watched some of that. Everybody started adding, and it's some of it is hilarious. But I think that so one of the methods I also want to add to your great answer there for the question on what about the company that's building door handles. One method that I was exposed to some time ago, years ago, was keep asking why. So why do we build door handles, right? Because doors need to be open. Why are there doors? Because houses need doors. Why are there houses, right? I mean, if you do that at some point and do that as a team, and if this is really a hard thing to know what the purpose is, that's one of the methods that I was exposed to. I thought it was a pretty interesting way to kind of get the organization kind of focused on the higher purpose, right? You want people to look at it just like the janitor who was looking at the higher purpose of his own job. But a company in the same way can look at the higher purpose of the company as part of as you said, like a value chain, right? And what value are they adding? The other thing you really mentioned that I want to highlight is the Tom's shoes. I mean, at the end of the day, their shoes are like any other shoes, and frankly, they're more expensive, but for what they are. But there's this higher purpose that for every pair you buy, they're donating a pair. And so that's, those are the kind of ways, there's so many ways that you can get creative and you can make this fun. It's not like, oh, shoot, we got to go find a purpose. It's like, oh, yay. Now we can maybe think about that and think about it for a bit to create a differentiator for our organization. With that, I do want to put another poll up here in the last few minutes that we have left. And this one is about, what are your key challenges, right? We're talking about the challenge of defining a purpose. What are your key challenges when, if you are trying to focus on building an intentional culture? You see some of the options here, limited resources, budget and experienced staff, managing the DEI effort, knowing what to measure, finding out how employees feel about the culture, right? Is like Deb, you were saying, just ask them maybe. Engaging the whole organization. There's a bunch of, of the answers here that you could choose from. But these are all ones that we hear about, and there's some that are more prevalent. So, for example, here we see finding out how employees feel about our culture, engaging the whole organization, and knowing what to measure are the top three right here. We see in the 50 to 60% have these challenges. Again, knowing what to measure, this comes up all the time, especially for leadership. Finding out how employees feel about the culture and then engaging all of the employees. Another one that's close, and this is on especially leaders' minds, is improving the organization's brand. And of course, limited resources always in there. Thank you for sharing. So these are, important ones to be aware of. I think as we go forward, we have a few minutes left, but I do want to ask, we always like to leave our audience with some specific real life examples. And you've already offered some very graciously, and we appreciate that. But anything else that if there's one thing you would like, our audience to, when they leave this webinar, there's so many webinars happening these days, and we try to make all of our webinars be really action oriented. So when people decide to spend half an hour with us, they have something they can get some benefit from going out and saying, hey, maybe I could try this, or at least some ideas that will take them, to the next step for their situation and their organization. What is the one thing you would say, maybe some real life example that you've seen actually happen in your experience, or just some question that they should ask themselves as they leave in the next few minutes and go on to their next the next webinar or the next Zoom meeting?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I've mentioned already, but I think one of the things that stands out to me is just this idea of engaging the whole team. When you think about the capacity of your team, and the capacity of the team that you're actually using on any given moment. I ask leaders all the time, what percentage of the capacity, the full capacity of your team are you leveraging at any given time? And generally the feedback I get is somewhere in the 60 to 80% range, that basically 20 to 40% is maybe going to waste, or I'm not really getting the absolute most out of the team. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But, when you take that into a manufacturing analogy, if you had a piece of equipment on the line that worked 60% of the time, you'd be fixing it, right? Or getting rid of it, right? So I think that we don't, looking at our human capital and looking at the capacity that we truly have, and leveraging that. And you mentioned the idea of how you deal with failure. I think that's a big piece of it. But really understanding what we could do to get more involvement and more from the team. And generally, it boils down to: are we asking? Are we talking? Are we engaging? If we do an annual survey, a lot of companies do that. Are we really showing that we're actually doing something with that information, or is it a sort of check the box kind of exercise? Having a two-way channel for communicating and listening, I think is a massive thing, and it's a really difficult thing in in a manufacturing environment, actually, because
Mm.
we're not, our team isn't all sitting in front of a laptop, right? They're out there doing their job. So finding those communication channels to give and get feedback and asking ourselves, are we really maximizing the capacity of our team, or are we going to the same usual suspects with every special project and every, event and all of that? That I think is a huge unlock. And, I mentioned earlier using things like business or employee resource groups. That can be a great channel on both sides for, getting and giving feedback, and then giving some of our maybe hidden talent visibility that maybe they don't have in their day-to-day jobs. But I think that would be probably my advice.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that this opportunity for everybody to two things, right? First, give their feedback or express their experiences or their ideas, and preferably in a very, preferably if possible with anonymity, the possibility to be anonymous, which really creates a psychologically safe space. That's really important. And I would say, just as an aside, our platform, for example, provides that, and it is available on a cell phone. What we found is, like you say, in the manufacturing environment, people aren't in front of the desktop, but we all have our phones and we all use our phones all the time. So that aspect of the only that capability actually for the environment in which they can, we call it actually the culture app, appropriately, because they can just, it gives people permission that this is really about talking about culture. And, ask any questions or any issues you have. The other thing is people being able to put up their hands and say they're interested in being involved in stuff instead of going to the usual suspects, as you just mentioned. We're running out of time, so I'm going to do two things that I do want to do. We have a couple of questions which we're going to try and cover. Before we do that, I do want to just kind of give we always like to give like next steps and where, what else can you do? I want to put this up, which gives you can, email us at DEI@OurOffice.io or Caroline at OurOffice.io. We can send this link and everything to you. It's a way for people to find out where their culture is. It's completely free. It's a DEI survey, and it takes about 15 minutes to fill out. So and then we also we will give. This is going on through the first quarter. But we will give some, winner badges at the end of this as well. So I think it's a good opportunity for anybody who's out there and just wants to get started and doesn't know what to do and doesn't have a budget yet or anything. We do this again as part of our research and service to the community. So please take advantage of that if you like. The other thing I must do is put up this next slide, which provides the codes. I'm going to leave it up for a minute as we go to the questions here. This is for the SHRM code as well as the HRCI code that you can use for your recertification credits. And so one good question is, this is the last couple of questions we'll ask, and then we have about 2 minutes. There are organizations like some governmental organizations where there's a lot of red tape. So how do you deal with that? How can you be intentional? It can be sometimes exhausting just dealing with this red tape, to be intentional in such an environment. That's quick, 30-second answer, and then we'll one other question.
Honestly, I think if I had to do a quick answer, I'd say give people permission to to come up with the solutions. And, and sometimes the solution is to say this part of the red tape is really not necessary. But again, it goes back to that, maximizing the resources you have. I think a lot of times red tape becomes what I call, self-imposed or learned constraints. We put the constraints on ourselves. And if you really unpack it, sometimes some of the bureaucracy that we have is actually, we've created it.
Mm. You know what, I love that answer, and I hope this is taken in the right content, in the spirit that it's meant for. I'd really say that you really need to, rather than see the limitations, and I say this from having been in the government for over 10 years and having dealt with, directly inside of the government at NASA, and then also as a prime contractor for the most of my career, the first 20 plus years of it. where we were also bound by federal regulations. There's laws of the land, which you, of course, cannot violate. We're not saying violate those. Please do not. Please be legal about everything you do. But then there's just like regulations and things that have come, over the years, people have built, and it's just how we do things. And you can challenge those, and you can actually talk to your leadership. You can, ask them to be part of the solution and use it as an opportunity and be growth minded. See the growth opportunities instead of focusing on the limitations. We have to leave it there. I knew we were going to run out of time. We had one other good question. We'll respond if you we'll leave this up for another few seconds, and you can put your email in there if you want us to answer offline. But thank you so much for the participation by everyone. Deb, I can't thank you enough. You are a true leader and a thought leader really among us. And we look forward to many more interesting conversations with you and everything that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Absolutely. Same here. Thank you so much. And goodbye, everybody. Please stay in touch with us. Bye-bye.